Hey, chess friends. I want to talk to you about a game played by Gukesh and Nodirbek Abdusattorov yesterday because it was exciting and because I'm interested in both players. And it's the second round of the Sinquefield Cup, which has just started. Later today, they'll play the third round. Jesse already made a very short video about Gukesh's disastrous first round with Prague, or you could say Prague's very wondrous and successful first round against Gukesh. And here we've got another clash between these representatives of this generation. There's kind of a quintet of teenagers who came up to join the world's top 10 about 2 years ago. And it's just like incredible seeing them clash with each other time and again. A couple words on Gukesh's first round. Obviously, I follow Gukesh pretty closely. Jesse pointed out that the time usage was troublesome. That's always what Jesse's harping on with Gukesh and saying, Gukesh, for example, after playing the Nimzo Indian, d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4, Nimzo Indian, standard opening for over 100 years at this point. After playing the Nimzo Indian, Prague played 4 e3, the most common, normal move against the Nimzo Indian, the main line if it had one, although it has several. And Gukesh sunk into thought for 9 or 10 minutes, and then he continued just burning up some time in the opening. And Jesse focused on the bad time usage, which definitely, it was a little bit weird where he was thinking there. But to me, there was a different thing that really stood out in that game, which was he got a terrible position out of the opening very, very quickly. And if some of you will remember that in Norway chess, I thought Gukesh got the worst set of positions by move 10 that I've seen any top 10 player get in a tournament, like ever. So it was just brutally horrible positions, like basically losing as white against the Pierce by move 10 and stuff like that. I mean, just so bad. And I'm like, how are you supposed to compete at this level when you are just in miserable position after miserable position by move 10 every single game? And the game with Prague, I'm not going to defend the time usage of thinking for 10 minutes on move 4, but no matter what time he had on the clock, he was going to lose that game to Prague with how badly he played that opening. And so I don't know I don't know how he made the choices he made in that opening. I don't understand. What was he thinking of? What was he looking for? Was he trying to reinvent the wheel? Was he trying to pick something that he had somewhere stored in his memory that Prague might not have seen? I don't know the story behind it, but I know that within very few moves, it was clear that his position was really bad. And then within a couple more moves, it was basically lost. And for most of that game, it was just hopelessly lost. And you could have given him back an hour on the clock, and he could not have escaped against Prague the way Prague played yesterday. Side note, we've recently learned that a 3600 computer would have somehow escaped against Prague from such a terrible position. But through human eyes, it just looked devastating very early on. From the moment that he played Rook d8, trying to challenge the d file without his rooks connected, and Prague played knight e5. For those of you who've seen that game, I think he was basically donezo. So I was worried, of course, like, oh my gosh, are we going to have more of Norway chess? Horrible opening positions, bad or failing, or what's going on with the opening prep? I expect actually high-level openings for a period of time from players who've just been in a world championship match. We've observed it in the last decade in the Magnus era. That was always the case, he and his opponents. But the second round game is luckily very different. Gukesh plays a very, very interesting opening, immediately gets an exciting fighting position, and we get into a slugfest. complicated position. This is a game where, more time could have helped Gukesh and Nodirbek because the position was just so complicated. Did they use their time badly? We'll leave that for Jesse to comment on more than me. Gukesh did play a few moves a little bit slowly. So this is a game where it would be nice to have more time, but he did come out on top anyway in the end. And these two are some of the greatest calculators in the world, right? So to see them go toe-to-toe in a calculation battle is just an epic game. And I was playing around with it for a couple hours yesterday, and eventually I thought, well, I've seen so many cool lines at this point, I should share some of them. So for anyone who just delights in seeing some really cool moves and some exciting chess and positions, this is a great one for you. So let's get into a few of the moves here. We're going to go into, we're going to go into an open Ruy Lopez. I think that's what it's called when black takes on e4, whereas other defenses to the Ruy Lopez versions of d6 and or b5 are going to be closed Ruy Lopez's in closed positions, so black takes, and there's only one pawn trade, so technically it's a semi-open position at first, but this is the open defense to the Ruy Lopez. And when I saw how violent yesterday's game was, it reminded me of a little bit of the style of position from the Kasparov-Anand Game 10 of their World Championship match in 1995. And I thought, I'm pretty sure the c3, d4 is the line from the Kasparov versus Anand game. And it is. In this position, Kasparov had actually played knight to g5 against Anand, at which point I think Anand maybe traded here and brought the queen in. Something like this. These were different days as far as how openings were studied and played, but there's still a feeling of some similarity here. I think this is the game Kasparov-Anand. I feel like I'm reconstructing it correctly at the moment. And this move here is actually sacking the rook on a1, right? Because black can trade the knight on b3. Now it's hanging. I think Anand played knight d4 before taking. But in any case, in any case, it led to a super complicated battle. Maybe the Kasparov-Anand game was something like here, knight d4, bishop e6, queen a1, bishop h6, maybe? Anyway, it was a very, very complicated barn burner kind of game. This game was too. And I mentioned this partly because, there are certain games in chess history that are super exciting, and there are certain variations that have like a hallmark or a feel or a style. Now, the open Ruy Lopez is having a bit of a resurgence lately, with Prague being another person who plays it as black. And so I think we may get a few more games in this. So suddenly it's interesting again to know what kind of style of positions it has. Prior to them, Korchnoi played this, many years ago, but there was a while where it was not the most popular, and now I feel like it's coming back. And it actually can lead to very, very weird and exciting lines like that Kasparov game and like the game we're about to see today. Obviously, back then, prep was done by hand, basically, right? When Kasparov came up with the idea of giving up this rook on a1, he didn't have any way to double check it. He had no way to be sure that it wasn't just losing or, giving, right? He could just lose the game with white straight out of the gates. If he's missed something, maybe he had a second or two, a human to double check it for him. But, he didn't have the assurance that we have with the computer. Nowadays, when Gukesh and Nodirbek are battling such positions, if they come up with a crazy idea, they can. And it's very nice to come up with ideas like this as a human, just staring at the board, come up with a concept, then feed it to the computer and have the computer tell you if it's insane or not. But they can always computer double check it and know if something's, winning or losing or more likely somewhere within reason. And then again, from a similar perspective, when you're playing the game and your opponent's playing some surprise line against you, you basically know they probably computer checked it, so it's probably not completely winning or losing. It's just super complicated, and you have to find your way. There's a different degree of sort of understanding what you're doing and what your opponent's doing when you get into these battles. But again, we're going to have a very, very dramatic imbalance very quickly in this game. In this case, Gukesh plays bishop c2, where Kasparov had played knight g5, and Nodirbek plays d3, defended by the knight and queen. And if you didn't know that this was opening theory, it would look like white's basically just blundering their face, right? Getting their bishop trapped on b1. You look at these three pieces, and the first impression is that this position is lost for white. Okay, you could have a different impression than me, different chess sense. That's part of the beauty of chess. We all have our own ideas. I'm just going to tell you, to my eyes, I look at this position at move 11, and if I didn't know it was theory, and if I didn't know that there were some good moves for white that I can't find on my own, I would think basically this is the trashiest line possible for white, just completely lost instantly, blundering right into d3 with bishop c2. And I notice here that Nodirbek thought a few minutes on d3, so he may have been sort of suspiciously wondering, what is Gukesh up to? What might he have prepared for me? Or he's double checking what line he wants to play. There's two different things to think about if you have some opening prep. If you don't have any opening prep, of course, you're just thinking about the board like a normal chess player would. But if you've got prep, there's two things to think about, right? What line that I know do I want to go for? And what line does my opponent have in mind that they're trying to steer me towards, right? What surprise or idea do they think they have? Is, do I know what's going on here as well or not as my opponent? So anyway, so we've got a first couple minutes used by Nodirbek there. Gukesh playing very quickly. You see he's over the 1 hour and 30, so he's showing that this is prep from himself, and he continues playing quickly, and Nodirbek castles queenside. And, this is a somewhat aggressive choice, I guess, from Nodirbek to go queen d5 and castles queenside, overprotecting this pass pawn on d3, which obviously gives black chances to win the game very easily if white doesn't find a great counter to it. In this case, Gukesh probably found a counter to this position to some extent before even coming to the board. But let me again give you like a human visual check. Human visual check, this position looks still like completely lost for white. That overprotected pawn in the middle of white's camp. Very strong passer, blocking the pieces, threatening to come to d2, honestly. If white ever tries to develop, they're going to have to move the blockading knight. Very, very scary. And black's development is ahead, right? They've got this nice pass pawn. They've got more development than white. There's only one factor against black, and it's not obvious how important the factor is going to be at first. But if you don't know what it is, this would be a really good chance for you to quickly test your positional understanding. This position is like outside of what I really have practiced much or know well. So I could be wrong, but I think I've got this one puzzle right, so I can give you the right answer to this. See if you get the right answer. There's only one real flaw in black's position to my mind. Otherwise, it would basically be a winning position or a clear advantage for black, this position. One positional factor against black. So my answer is the king position, the king safety. That's the only factor missing for black, which means to some extent, if you move these pawns back to b7 and a7, black might have a big advantage. And I suppose I could set that up and test it at some point to see how right or wrong I am in my conception of this position. But I think basically the only problem is that in order to quickly, power up this pawn on d3 with the rook on d8, black has committed the king to an area of the board with some significant pawn structure gaps, right? Weird, raggedy pawns. That's part of what the Ruy Lopez is supposed to do, is get black to chase off that bishop to reduce the early pressure on c6 and e5, and then replace it with, queenside weaknesses, and then you castle your king into that area, it's going to be a factor. In any case, this game is going to bear that out. For much of the game, the main factor in Gukesh's favor and against Nodirbek is going to be king safety. So we're going to track that factor in the position all the way through the game. I imagine this position to a computer is like perfectly balanced. I think they probably both played theory so far, and it's probably basically equal or something to a computer, meaning the advantages and disadvantages cancel each other out. Gukesh is going to have to get these pieces into the game, which is not easy. Otherwise, the king safety will not be a factor. King safety is only a factor if your opponent has active pieces or can at some point get active pieces. So in this position, I would expect, basic moves would be moves like knight b3, maybe a4, an exchange sack, right? A4 with the idea of knight a4, rook a4, pawn takes a4, queen takes a4. See, that would be a way to start digging some of the white pieces out, but also emphasize the king safety factor. Probably after queen b5, it's not a very good line for white, but that's just an offhand thought, not a line that I studied yesterday. But yeah, a4 would be like the kind of move white could maybe want to play. It might also allow the bishop to come back out here after going through b3, c2 to b1. But also knight b3, very logical, right? Moving the piece out and letting the bishop come out to e3 or f4. But Gukesh plays, to me, an absolutely shocking move. He plays knight to g5, moving one of his only, two pieces, the knight on f3 and the rook on e1. The only two pieces that are kind of properly placed that I wouldn't be thinking of moving, right? So how could Gukesh surprise me in this position? By playing rook f1 or knight g5, basically. And he plays one of those moves. And mind you, still in a couple seconds. So this is still his prep. And at this point, I think it starts to emerge as very likely that Nodirbek is dealing with Gukesh being a little bit more prepped for the game. So, crazy Gukesh idea to create imbalances, excitement. I say crazy a little bit too easily there, but maybe not completely crazy, but intense, right? There's an intensity to this. We know that Gukesh, when he's at his best, he's playing sort of interesting moves in the opening that create a fight, that create a complicated position, that create a battle where it doesn't matter so much who's 2/10 of a pawn ahead or behind in computer evaluation, but who's going to play better in a very long, super complicated battle, and where he'll be able to flex his superior calculation ability. Now, that said, I say superior, I mean superior in general. I'm not specifically saying he's better at calculating than Nodirbek. Nodirbek would be one of the 3 or 4 names in the world who might calculate on a comparable level to Gukesh. But, he's confident and he enjoys it, so he's going to do calculation battle with Nodirbek here. What's the idea of this move versus something like knight b3 or some other move? To me, one idea is to take the bishop and weaken Black's light squares, grab the bishop pair. Another idea could be to bring the knight to f3 instead of b3, where it would be offering a trade. There's a little thing where the knight on c5 maybe doesn't have the most obvious squares to go to. When I was thinking about this position with the black pawns on b7 and a7, I thought to myself, well, then if white plays b4, isn't it kind of awkward for that knight? It no longer has the a4 square, so we're talking about playing knight d7 and jamming up kind of all of our other pieces. Now, of course, you could maybe go knight d7, knight b6, and keep playing, but there's something a little awkward with this knight, so maybe that's one reason not to be looking at knight b3. Maybe also knight b3, this weird pawn trade going into an endgame is not good for white. Just throw this line out there. In general, this is a queen trade and a weird pawn trade, right? In general, since the only deficit in Black's position is king position, this kind of a line is going to throw away White's only advantage and probably leave them with a very, very bad position. It could be lost. It could just be worse. I don't know, but This is likely to be very bad for white, this normal knight b3 move that I suggest as being kind of like an instinct move. You just look at the board, you think of playing moves like knight b3 and a4 because you think about fixing your bad pieces. Something else that Jesse has always emphasized to me is like, don't just play with your pretty pieces, right? Fix your bad pieces, get everybody involved. And here, of course, we've got Gukesh saying, I've got no way to play with my ugly pieces. I'm just going to keep playing with the one pretty piece here.
Quick time out here. Did you know that the dojo is an incredible site with tactics, a database, a community of people trying to improve, a training program? All of this is going on at our site. So go check it out. ChessDojo.club. Hit the link in the description.
The move looks terrible. You know, when I first clicked through the game and I saw this move, I thought that's, you know, there's no hope in that move. Nodirbek thought for a while, but he played a very comfortable move for black. Knight e5, eliminating white's center pawn, going ahead a pawn, and continuing to overprotect this pawn on d3. And at this point, you're like, what on earth is the justification for playing like this as white? And now Gukesh strikes on the other side with a4. And, yeah, it's just immediate mayhem and madness here, right? Just tons of things to calculate. Obviously, the white piece is still undeveloped, but he's hoping to open up the rook at least. And if he can just get rid of that a pawn, the rook's already in the game. And then we've got questions about black's king that are going to start emerging, despite the incredible center of black, right? Look at this clump of pieces all protecting each other, the pawn, white bottled up. It's crazy, but, you know, ultimately, if white can get some pieces out, avoid some trades, that king is always going to be a factor. So at this point, still playing every move in seconds. It's Gukesh. Nodirbek is working hard, plays bishop d6. And now we're kind of getting to the end of Gukesh's prep, and I think this is where he starts using tons of time. First, he spends 8 minutes on trading on b5, which to me is almost automatic. It's just an accomplishment. You got to do this. They didn't take on a4. None of those lines particularly worked for black. Congrats for you. You know, that's great. Actually, maybe I'll just say one thing about this. If knight a4, perhaps the idea would be bishop a2, and the queen is kind of overworked defending e5 and e6. If black tries this knight c4 move, it'll just lose a piece because the b pawn will be overworked, right? Oh, sorry, I'm hanging the knight on g5. I have to trade it first, huh? Let me do just that. I'll take here, attacking this, and then trade on c4, trade on a4 with an extra piece, right? So bishop a2 probably can't play knight here. Maybe a move like queen d6, trying to keep in touch with all these pieces here. And white's got this crazy possibility of sacking to win the rook on h8, but I think black probably wins against white's back rank there. Like this move here. And by the way, you can start to feel with this line, you're going to start to feel the calculation burn of this game. That move looks like, queen e2 looks like it crushes white and refutes this idea. This is just the start. That's like a little line compared to what's going on in this game. So, queen over there. Seems to hold up for the moment. White could do this to get pieces out. The queen can stay on the e6 bishop now and not this knight. Oh, then there's bishop e3. I'll go to the more typical square over here. Maybe see some development for white, see some development for black, and give back a pawn on e6. Or try to calculate our way out of trouble with this move. check here. Here I'm planning to reunite the dangling hanging knights on c4. Man, oh man. There's a lot going on here, right? We could trade on e5 and then either take on e6 or play f4 looking for knight f7. I almost don't trust myself to win a rook here with, you know, some weaknesses to my king and d2 and knight g4 and bishop c5 moves for black. If I simply take this pawn, how many pawns have I sacked? I'm down 2 pawns as white. Attacking this rook. Idea to maybe go knight to d4 and just go after. Yeah, if you can win 1 pawn back here from black, you're definitely going to be in business with that weak king. It's so complicated. It's so hard to say how these lines should go. And so Nodirbek spent 11 minutes on bishop d6. And I would say this is perfectly good time usage. You know, you get into a position this complicated, you have to start making choices. Your opponent's prepped. Honestly, Nodirbek almost played a little bit quickly here, to my mind, with bishop d6. Maybe he knew a little something about the position. Was a little bit concerned, but also knew a little something, because these lines are getting really, really hard to calculate very fast. And these are the kind of positions, I want to say, where to me, I can totally understand spending a lot of time. So here we get bishop a2 in 28 minutes from Gukesh. So this is where we're going to stop and talk about time usage again for a moment. So basically, where does one get stuck using a lot of time in chess games? I have 2 different places where I often get stuck using a bunch of time. One is like this, a position with lots and lots of different tactical possible moves. So in this position, white could play bishop a2 or b4. Then once they do, there's a lot of branches. You can also throw in knight e6 at any moment, right? So for example, I guess you could play knight e6 first, right? And then play bishop a2 or b4. Or you could play b4 first, and then if black plays knight a4, then you could take on e6, or you could play bishop a2 first and then take on e6. Or you could play bishop a2 without b4, and then if they play knight c4, take on e6. If they play queen c6, you know, play b4, take on e6. There are certain positions like this. To me, they're much, much harder to calculate than the kind of things that we normally see in the normal discourse of chess around puzzles and things like that, where, you know, there's a forced win or there's a clear continuation that's better than all the other continuations. Here it's murky. You don't know if you're better or worse. You don't have a lot of signposts in terms of evaluation, right? Maybe you imagine that it's close to equal to begin with, but then once you're looking at 5-6 move variations and there's 6 different branches of them, you have no assurance what the evaluation is on any of those branches. You don't know if you found a line that's really good for white or really good for black or just equal. And there's so many options. And then finally, because it's very just calculation based, sometimes there's not a strong instinct to help guide you. So you just kind of look at all the moves and you're just waiting for the moves to tell you what's good or bad. In other words, there's not a principle that tells you that knight e6 or bishop a2 followed by knight e6, which one's better, right? Or whether you should play b4 first or after. I don't think there's not like a chess principle that says what's right. Or a similar situation I want to bring up. No, let's see, just a little bit sooner. Is it here or here? I think it was here. Let me check. So a lot of my notes seem to have been deleted from here. But it doesn't make sense, does it? Queen G5. Pawn takes. Right. Okay. So in a position like this, there's often not an instinct that tells you, right. Yeah, it was this moment. Okay. So the note got deleted, but there's not an instinct that tells you if you should retreat the knight to D7 or B7, or whether you should play H6. I think the Queen G5 move, again, there's no instinct that tells you should or shouldn't play this. I think it fails fairly easily to Knight C4, hitting the queen with the idea of taking away this bishop with check, so there's no counter threat, and black will eventually lose the knight. But as I recall, when I was watching this game yesterday, and the move H6 came into mind, it's like there's no instinct or principle that's telling you whether you should be playing knight d7 or h6, or even which one you should be calculating first. You know, part of the point of h6 is that if white takes here, this knight is going to be saved by this, right? So this is the kind of position where I would understand Nodirbek thinking forever. Now, oddly, Nodirbek only spent about 4 minutes on this, but this stood out to me as the kind of position where I might spend a long time calculating personally as black, unless I'd, pre-calculated it on the previous move. Maybe he calculated it on Gukesh's time, because Gukesh spent 20 minutes on b4 in addition to the 28 minutes on bishop a2, one move before. So since Gukesh has spent 50 minutes on the last two moves and an hour on the last three moves, maybe Nodirbek managed to really work hard on his opponent's time here. But this is to me like a typical example of the kind of choice that can burn up your clock, because some of these moves might be winning or losing. Very, very hard to, you can't just say, well, my instinct is this, I've spent 10 minutes, I have to play this, if there's no instinct in the position, okay? So the two things that lead me to burn time, this is one of the two. The other is when I struggle with like an evaluation. And that's maybe a slightly more personal thing for me, but sometimes you look at a couple lines, they're not necessarily complicated lines, but you just struggle with evaluating. Depends what your strengths and weaknesses are as a player. I think that's one of my relative weaknesses, is that there are some positions where I just don't really know what the evaluations are. And I suppose almost everybody has some positions where they can evaluate more quickly and comfortably, and others where they can't. And so depending which positions you land in, evaluating is more or less of a burden for you. But here the players are in one of these positions. It's still early on in the game. It's not looking for forced wins or losses. But, one continuation might be good for white and one might be completely good for black. And how to pick, when the variations are so long. And I played around with this position, and even playing around with it, I couldn't really determine what's better or worse. I clicked a little bit into a computer to sort of like see what it thought about some of these opening moves here. And even looking with the computer, it was just very hard to figure out, which lines are coming out ahead or not. White still, it's so hard to evaluate because this factor, this pawn that's so powerful, the white pieces that are trapped, and white's compensation is the black king that's weak. But right now, there's no white pieces fighting it, so visually, it's not clear what white's doing yet visually. So Gukesh burns all this time, right, and gets this position here. Takes, this idea of rook a5, trying to undermine black's defense of these light squares. That's kind of the idea. And white gives up their own light squared bishop to do it. But right here, I think Gukesh has achieved the triumph of his opening idea, and then he makes a huge mistake and continues developing, or finally develops. And Nodirbek's able to save the light squared bishop. And I think that's the first big moment of the game. And this is not what Gukesh agonizes about, but I thought as I was watching, I was trying to guess what's the point of all this stuff with b4 and bishop a2. And I think I actually figured out the purpose of Gukesh's moves, which he somehow didn't exactly do. But I think the point is to then play queen g4 after breaking up these pawns, and then they start falling. You know, if black plays a move like e5 to defend the e-pawn, there's no way to defend it with pieces, right? If they play a move like e5, then we're going to take out the pawn on c4. I'm, again, not going to trade queens if I don't have to. And now I've equalized material, and my development's not looking so bad, right? It's only one piece that isn't developed, and we can see issues with the black king. And I think when I sparred this a little bit with the computer yesterday, it wanted to just give the pawn on e6 like so. Threatening quickly rook e8, which is such a big threat that I have to trade queens for white. But what the computer conceded to me was that I won a whole pawn now for white, right? Now Gukesh is up a full pawn, just from the tactics of, you know, e6 and c4 cracking. And the computer said, you know, things are desperate enough for black that it would rather give a pawn and play an endgame than play this kind of position here, rook e8, knight c4, something like this, where we get to keep playing a middle game. And yeah, again, here I would not play queen c4 for white. It may feel safer, right? I felt a little risky here, knight c4, like my stuff is dangling on the c file. I was worried, you know, okay, h5, I guess I can take here with check to save my piece. But it's just, if there's any way to keep queens on the board, any way to stay in the middle game, white wants to do so, because this king is a real problem, and it's a problem that is not going away. The only way the king safety issue gets resolved for Nodirbek is queens get traded. That's the only way, pretty much. So we just have to keep queens on the board. And I remember the computer thought this position was very good for white if black defended the pawn. So the opening battle has sort of worked out for Gukesh at first, but when he doesn't break the light squares with knight e6, Nodirbek plays bishop d5, and it's obvious this piece is amazing. Of course, the position overall is chaotic, so it's easy not to notice how important one factor is or another, right? But we can see how important this piece is. It can defend the king. It can cement this protected pass pawn on d3 now. It's on an open diagonal where there's counterplay against g2. White can't deal with this piece at all. And so it's a little bit weird that Gukesh didn't take it. But I will say, okay, I know what his idea is here with knight f3. His idea is to take the knight from d2, bring it to d4, start to run the queen more out of squares, right? And he's like, I've got all these hoppies, right? My knights are hopping all over the place. They're going to cause problems for the black king. He certainly already saw themes of playing b5 and dropping the knight into c6 with problems for black. He saw the queen's low on squares to go to when we get here. He saw this knight could come back through e4, could take on e6. It's a jumble of complicated variations. But nevertheless, Nodirbek correctly keeps the bishop, tucks the queen on the one square she has. It'd be nice if she had more squares. She doesn't. She tucks back. And now Gukesh completes development. Just calm, quiet move, aimed this way. Bishop g2, knight f7, bishop h1, stuff like that may already look savage, but white has an f3 resource available. So I think that for now, this is not going to be some genius exchange stack. It looks reasonable to try and counterattack white so that you're not... That's, I guess, the other way you could get out of the problem of defending your king forever is if you can open up the other person's king so it's a two-way street instead of a one-way street, and then we're all fighting like crazy. But here, with the knight on d4, white has this f3 resource. So bishop h1 and h3 don't really threaten much. And basically white's going to win an exchange, put the queen on g4, and white's pieces are all pretty well placed. So this is not quite the exchange sack that we're looking for, even though in general, if you can turn the tables on who's got the initiative a little bit, if you can fight for the initiative by giving an exchange sack, you've got the D3 pawn as extra compensation to back you up in a lot of scenarios if trades happen. That's the right feeling for the position is sacking an exchange. But the right move in this position is H6, backing the knight off as Nodirbek does, and then bringing the knight out to B6. Just kind of further coordinating and improving Black's pieces. And now, yeah, we see the power of this bishop. White can't really make any further inroads here. Even if you go b5 and knight c6 in this position, all you're doing is trading your knight for the same bishop you could have traded for on e6 and didn't, right? So white goes knight to d2. Here bishop takes g2 is even worse than earlier because now white has just queen g4 check. Double attack, cleaning it up. And in general, I think one of the things white might have in mind here is queen g4 check, king b8, rook e to a1. That kind of creates a full board coordination of the white pieces. And so Nodirbek says, Gukesh is struggling here a little bit. He retreats this knight, just trying to bring his queen to g4. Here's a very handy move for black, right? I take away queen g4 and I prepare to, pawn storm myself eventually because I don't have a way to reclad my own king with pawns, right? So I just have to denude the white king to make up for it. And now Gukesh goes in another direction with knight b5. Going for, knight takes d6 or knight a7 or rook a7. We get bishop c6 from Nodirbek. I noticed that actually knight takes d6 check might have been a nice little opportunity for Gukesh here, switching to attacking the king side instead of the queen side. I don't know if both players noticed this rook h5 and if they both thought it was or wasn't anything. Nodirbek spent 20 minutes here on bishop c6 in this position where he's got a lot of freedom of choice. I imagine he considered rook h5, but I thought white would be really good here, and I double-checked it with a computer, and it agreed. The idea is we just open up some space on the king side when this queen... This is an idea that I had basically from my experience playing Fischer Random instead of normal chess. From Fischer Random, I found sometimes a queen gets stuck in a corner for a while, right? And then you can accomplish things elsewhere on the board. And this is a little bit of a Fischer Random theme applied to normal chess. That queen is stuck on b7 long enough that white is probably going to pillage at least one more pawn on the king side, and then suddenly we're talking about a 3-1 majority on the king side. Black's always going to have counterplay with this pawn on d3. It's always going to be a tough battle here. It's not going to be a knockout. But the computer agreed with me that this would be kind of nice for white. Instead, Gukesh does something that's more thematically consistent, which is he goes after the light squares. One thing I can't explain about this game is why he didn't just trade his knight for the light squared bishop, initially long ago. But the idea is now he goes after that trade, and he's going to be able to try and keep going after these light squares here in the sequence that follows, right? So now the second knight comes back out to d2 to d4, going after the same squares. Nodirbek centralizes that rook, correctly spotting that with white trying to play on the A file, he's going to maybe have great counterplay on the E file in the center. So he abandons the kingside pawn push for the moment, brings the rook into the center, knight d4 hitting the queen, queen comes to e4, and this is a very, very cool idea. White plays b5, but I want to show the strength of this queen e4 idea from Nodirbek by playing this queen h5 move, which I asked myself about. I asked myself about this move partly because I love eating pawns, partly because I'd had the theme of taking this pawn earlier. And, in general, this doesn't look so bad bringing our queen into light squares, but we're weak on this e-file, and I was wondering if black would have this tactic, bishop takes b4, and they do. I quickly confirmed that bishop takes b4, threatening the rook, and also threatening to take on c3, which would hurt quite a lot. And if pawn takes bishop, queen d4, even more powerful than rook d4. You could take with either piece as black to recover the piece, and the combination is sound, right? We sack the bishop on b4, we get our piece back on d4. You could take either way, it's fine. But here the point is, I want to exchange sack and push, right? Like even if white plays queen f7, I may be looking at rook takes, pawn takes, and then leaving my queen hanging, emphasizing that passed d pawn on d3, which I've been terrified about this entire game since I watched these games, kind of slightly biased as a fan of Gukesh. I've been scared of that d3 pawn the whole game. I was just waiting for something like this to happen, and now, it's happened. I imagine this is sound. I'm pseudo-sacking the queen, but this looks like this is not a variation I prepared, but I assume that this is just crushing for black. We threaten c2. Maybe they try and forestall us. Knight c4 looks nice coming forward, but maybe knight d5 to b4 is even more accurate, trying to get control of c2, right? Where's this rook going? Yeah, it's gotta be dead. Super obvious, right? So queen d4, preparing to sack the rook on e3, and white's just dying to that d pawn. So position is very, very much scary for both sides here. Gukesh continues with his theme, right? He gets out of the way of bishop takes b4 partly, prepares knight c6 check, and so now bishop b4, the pawn is here so he can play knight c6, which he couldn't before. And yeah, I guess, maybe black could even sack the queen, and it's not obvious, huh? Not obvious who's better. Yeah, I could believe that black might be all right here. I guess white should start by, keeping the c pawn and trying to keep the blockade with this bishop. If rook takes, then bishop takes probably loses to d2. So I guess queen takes, even though I wanted to bring my queen out here, as you all know. I don't know. The battle goes on. Black would like to remove this pawn. It's kind of a thorn in their side. It's preventing them from going and winning the c pawn because of queen b1. Right? You can't successfully take on c3 and let white's queen into b7. Maybe it's not even that clear, that bishop b4 variation, but Nodirbek plays the logical, sane move of moving his king out of the way of knight c6 check. The knight comes into c6 anyway. And now he offers an exchange sack. And this seems very reasonable. And also, I think, in addition to knight takes rook and maybe rook a7, I think a major threat could be bishop takes b6 in some case. There's back rank mate. So how would it look? Yeah, I think if rook a8, the problem is that on rook takes, if you go rook takes, you would then lose the knight, right? So you can't just defend the a file with the rooks. And I imagine if you take with your king or your knight, then, you have to have calculated accurately a potential rampage from white's queen here. It's a rather short rampage. So if you've calculated it correctly, you would not go into this line as black. So knight c6, maybe the exchange sack was partly forced versus desired, but maybe when he played king b7, he foresaw knight c6 winning the rook anyway. I imagine he did, because this is exactly on theme for what black wants to do. And around here, or maybe a move or two before this, it started really clicking with me or coming together for me that the game really felt like an opening that I used to play, the Botvinnik variation of the semi-Slav, a variation where black often has a very open king on the queen side, but they have a pawn majority on that side of the board. And a lot of endgames black can win with their pawn majority. Either player is willing to sack material because the imbalances are so stark in the Botvinnik variation. The difference compared to the Botvinnik is in the Botvinnik, black's missing the g and h pawns, so white's often winning by just running an h pawn up the board. So there's two ways white can win in the Botvinnik, the h pawn winning or the black king getting slaughtered. This game has that Botvinnik feel where sometimes you could lose heavy material with black and then win with the d pawn. White's threatening to checkmate your king, and sometimes you get checkmated. Sometimes they just win some material with their attack, and it's not good enough. So suddenly I felt very comfortable evaluating some of the stuff that was going on. You know, I just nod my head at the exchange stack, makes sense. I didn't think it was even, my instinct wasn't even to take the exchange stack. For Gukesh, my instinct was that something like Queen A1, you know, looking for a checkmating attack would have been correct. And here, let's just go through some variations just for the joy of seeing chess variations, okay? I know sometimes when you're watching a chess video, it can be overwhelming that there's tons of variations. What am I supposed to learn from it? What's the point? Like, just give me the idea. Sometimes chess is just about variations. There's not exactly a point. And variations aren't just overwhelming. They're also fun and beautiful. So here I'm going to show you variations for funsies, okay? Not because I'm trying to prove anything, just because I think they're really cool. I look through so many variations. I don't know exactly what they prove either. Just that, you know, chess is beautiful and that these two players are great calculators and that they created a rich position. That's another thing to say. Both players have opted in throughout this game for a game where they could try to out-calculate each other. They've each played for a violent battle. Nodirbek by choosing to castle queenside early in the game. Gukesh by preparing this line with knight g5, a4, which has a certain degree of madness to it. So let's just go through some of my variations. Rook a1 check, king c8, bishop takes b6, and check here, push, c takes b6. So here, not only is the exchange hanging like before, but the full rook is hanging, right? Rook check, king c7, rook takes rook. That's looking like a lot. The black king is surrounded by white pieces. White's also up at a rook. Like they could be playing a move like rook d6 and winning the game at some point soon, right? In this position, however, I found a very cool little draw that Nodirbek might have had in mind. This could be a calculation puzzle on its own, just black to play. It's a funny little symmetry. I mean, we don't have that many pieces, so it's not that hard if you know it's a puzzle. But if it were mixed in with positions that weren't puzzles, threatening back rank mate, and if queen d2, there's queen b1. These white pieces can't get to the back rank at the moment. King f1 to stop queen e1, then we just repeat like this, check, here, here. I think we've just got a little forced draw for black in that line. So white would not be advised to win the full rook here with rook a8. That doesn't work. White could now take the exchange, kind of like in the game, in this slightly simplified position, and then play rook a2. And at first when I saw this, I thought, that's it. White's basically won the game, because I have the idea bishop f4 is forced or whatever, right? And then I go g3, and the bishop retreats, and I go f4, and that's the end of the game, right? White's got a rook against the bishop, and the black king's just completely open. That's the end. But here I found one last shocking resource for black. Check out this idea. That's not at all clear. Queen e5, threatening the same back rank mate as before, but okay, white just plays rook a1, and still, if you retreat your bishop and it gets blocked out, it's kind of the end of this guy. But now, queen c3, just leaving the bishop hanging, gf4, centralize the queen, and we're in time to defend that pawn. Now, I see no way for white to win this position. Maybe there is one, but it would basically entail you'd have to make a threat to checkmate the black king that's faster than black queening their pawn. I didn't see how to win this. This is crazy, down to full rook again for black. No immediate perpetual, just kind of a positional draw that these two pawns are as strong as a rook-ish, you know, or that's the claim. I don't know for sure what the truth is. So these rook a7 lines came out pretty similar in some sense to what Gukesh played with knight takes d8 in the game. The other line that I had in mind was rook a1. And here after king c8, we pursue with rook a7. My threat here is basically to go queen a6 check, king d7, and take the knight with my queen, keeping the e-file defended. And against d2, rook d1. And hopefully I still hold the blockade on that pawn. Obviously, black's got all kinds of tactical possibilities still here. Now king d7 has to flee from queen a6, I think. I don't know. Bishop takes b6, takes, rook e8. And here I found another fantastical resource for black. So I'm saving the rook here before playing d2. Notice that black can't recover the piece. So this is like this is winning a whole piece for Gukesh, this line that I'm trying here for white. Rook e8, bishop e3, d2 I came up with here. And can you see what my idea is if white just takes this? Queen d2, bishop d2 seems to cover the back rank mate, right? Like, what on earth is black doing? They're down a full piece. What? How am I playing d2 in this position? Obviously, bishop d2, you could take the queen. What's the point if the queen takes? All right, I'll tell you. Rook e3. With a weird overwhelming of the back rank and the defenses of each other of the pieces. If queen e3, queen d1, and you can't get back, right? If f e3, queen takes queen. If queen d5, rook e1. This just immediately wins for black. It's a knockout. So on d2, I think white has to go queen d1. And the position remains crazy. I don't see, my conclusion about this variation seems to have been cut off. But I think I recall that I was sacking this again in order to come in like so. Down a full rook again for black. Idea is to like take here and then go here. So maybe white has to play rook a1. And then maybe again, maybe I can take here and get my pawn to c3 before you can win this pawn. So another position up, an entire rook for white, but no idea if white can win. Not only might black have a draw by repetition or by position, there's probably even some scenarios where black wins down a full rook here. It probably happens, right? And how the extra bishop and knight compare to the other position play into it. They give black some extra options to attack white on the dark squares against the king. But they also give white, extra options like knight e5 if black plays bishop c5 at the wrong time. And some different mating nets around the king, right? Where the queen could get loose if g4 weren't covered and deliver an immediate checkmate. So super, super exciting, complicated variations. I don't know for sure what was correct. Maybe somebody else turned on a computer and then made a computer summary of this game, and they can tell you, obviously, this one sequence here was winning. But what I can show you is that in this position, Gukesh could have been considering rook a1, rook a7, queen a1, knight d8, and it would be very hard for him to know which one was right. This is somewhere where if he had more time on the clock, I think he could do marvels with those variations, which even moving the pieces, like I'm not really sure of. I think Gukesh can handle that, and this is somewhere where having more time on the clock would have helped him, and you could criticize his time usage earlier, but notice that Nodirbek has even less time either. So they're each, susceptible to needing some time for all these calculations that this game has required of them. It is an argument, however, for being as judicious as possible with your time if you know you're playing a game of this difficulty level where your time will be worth something to you later on, right? He takes, to my mind, the least likely to be right of the three moves, queen a1, rook a7, and knight d8. That knight was really good around the black king. It sort of releases tension. I don't see black ever spending time, saving the rook from our knight because it would cut off the escape squares of this king, right? Rook c8, rook a7 mate, and rook d7. You saw the king also need that square, right? The king will come here and then quickly get mated by queen a1. So I don't think that exchange is going anywhere. My instinct is that was the wrong move to try and win the game. But anyway, the game keeps going, and I think black is very much back in it here. Quickly comes back to the e file emphasizing this stuff. With queen a2, I think Gukesh had in mind to play rook a1 here, and then after rook e8, I think he aborted. But I think the idea here was probably to play rook here, or maybe to play bishop takes b6, rook a4. But here he's got to abort the idea. So let me show you. If rook a1, black has bishop c5. There's two pieces defending a8, so there's no rook a8 checkmate just yet, right? You could play bishop c5, and if the queen takes, then you can give checkmate. However, the idea of bishop c5 is that on bishop c5, again, we unleash the passed pawn, just threatening rook e1 back rank mate and d1 back rank mate. White can't stop both. The piece we've just taken, we could block the d file. It doesn't block the e file, right? We could block the e file. It wouldn't block the d file. So it just loses. The move looks less explosive than other d2 moves I've played, but I think this just loses for white. So I think Gukesh in the scramble has to reverse plans and just come back here and overprotect these pieces in order to keep the pawn blockaded. And this is where I feel like black has taken over and Nodirbek has the advantage and knight c6 has gone wrong. Unless the computers disagree with me, in which case I take back everything I said. But this is a phase that I didn't double check. But now we're in like this like Botvinnik position where I feel like I've got an idea what's going on and how to evaluate it. This is a situation where a knight and a passed pawn can do very, very well against a rook if it's such a strong passed pawn, and white is turning very passive. I think maybe Nodirbek wastes a move on h4, maybe even h4, h3 here. And this is where he should be continuing consequently. Oh, he plays rook e4. Weird. This is where I feel he should be playing consequently to trade his bishop for white's bishop and keep his knight. I think that's a very, very important theme of this position, that actually the knight is more dangerous for queening this pawn than the bishop is, because the knight can break the blockades of the pawn better. So very, very rare nowadays to see a lot of positions where knights are better than bishops. Everybody, including me, is on the bishop train, but this is definitely a kind of position where the knight is better, breaking blockades, using a passed pawn like this in the endgame. The knight is so much more useful for black than their dark squared bishop would be. So white wants to try and trade on b6, and black should be trying to trade the dark squared bishop. So rook e4. What was the point of rook e4? Well, I'm not sure, but I have an alternate variation that I put in, so this is surely my suggestion of what black should have done. Queen e5, threatening mate on h2 just for tempo, and now bishop c5 when you can't take. Yeah, obvious line, David. Good work. And then white's going to defend. I'm going to take rook e3, queen b5, defending my rook, just cleaning up an extra pawn, just looking towards the endgame now. And I think black's simply better here. If it were Botvinnik and black were missing both of these pawns on the king side, then there'd be counterplay from the h pawn, maybe. But here I feel like, you know, as we trade pieces, this black queen, she can come in, try and force a queen trade. This knight can go to d5 and c3. I think black's probably winning, if white's not losing, it's because of one specific miracle defense. Because in the Botvinnik, you're kind of dead when you hit these sorts of positions. So yeah, so that was my clear line for black. I don't know why I didn't put bishop c5 immediately as the recommendation, but this queen e5 line looks really clear. I think it's because of e8, right? Yeah, of course, it's because of e8. So takes, rook's hanging. We can't recapture while defending the rook. Takes, check. Right, white gets into a good square. Now black is passive here on defense. The knight's not going to be hopping in anywhere. White can maybe put the queen on d8 to cover the pawn from here. Also, this pawn's defended, so this rook can drop back. And so it feels much less good for black, this version, right? Clearly. So we prefer queen e5 to prevent bishop takes c5. Then we come here, we trade on our terms when we collect this pawn. and white's pieces stay passive, just blockading this pawn from in front of it, which will let the knight be as powerful and active as it wants to be. What the idea was exactly with rook e4, I'm not sure. But he advances with this, and then Gukesh makes a great decision under, definitely they're under time pressure, but there's a little bit of an instinct to it. Maybe you can feel that the knight is the more valuable piece than the bishop here. He gets this trade, and now you see this pawn is not really likely to get through d1 now with the dark squared bishop. It could go to d2, then your bishop's just going to be stuck defending it. Meanwhile, he's got chances against the open king with the extra exchange. That's still the one thing that white really has is the threats to the king, right? And nice move, queen a2, move 40, going after the king. Nodirbek has some time now to make these moves. Looks like he probably played rook e4 and h4 too quickly. Those moves, I'm not sure what they did. Maybe should have used more of his 8 minutes there, because after that bishop for knight trade, he is just dying here. King gets chased. Gukesh collects a pawn. They now have both plenty of time on the clock, and Gukesh can just calculate this thing out, make sure that, that at every step something like d2 doesn't work. Here, I think one easy answer to d2 is to trade the queen on c6 and then play rook d1 and collect the d-pawn. There's probably other options too, like d2, queen e3 also looks even easier than queen c6. You stop queen e1 and get control of this pawn. I don't know. You have to calculate a little something, hopefully rook a7's checkmate. But so we get queen e5 going after the c3 pawn. But he checks, plays g3 here. And now if black took on c3, they would lose the bishop on d6. Or the king to rook a7, right? Guess it's the king goes with the bishop here. And hunting. Nodirbek plays d2. Gukesh collects another pawn. Queen e1, queen f1. This is it. Nothing more to see, right? Black just doesn't have enough pieces anymore. And resigned here. So it was an epic battle of calculations. Tons of long variations to look at. I think that each player had their chances. They each played confidently for a position with many chances to win or lose for both sides. I love that. I love that we're getting such epic battles, that they're sort of reinventing the Botvinnik variation in a sense here with that kind of high stakes, somebody's going to lose, somebody's going to die. I think the final turning point of the game was Nodirbek not appreciating how bishop takes b6 would be so good. The knight's not immediately moving. It's not so obvious how great it is on b6, but that was the better piece than this long-range bishop. And he should have made sure to trade the bishops with an advantage or maybe a win even for black. And after he gave Gukesh time to trade on b6, then Gukesh took over and calculated the end very cleanly. I don't want to go over those calculations as much because they're sort of more clear cut. And what I love was just the mayhem and the madness of the meat of this game, so to speak, when we have the balance between black's weak king, but black's active pieces in the center and the latent threat, all these tactical resources with the d-pawn. So many positions where black can be equal or better down an exchange or a piece or a rook even just off of that d-pawn. So it was an epic battle. A better opening selection from Gukesh here than in his first game, obviously, with Prague, and hopefully, a sign that this whole tournament isn't going to be a sequence of him being in bad shape by move 10 every single game like Norway chess. And, both of these players playing with a lot of confidence and sort of suggesting that we're going to have more exciting games throughout the Sinquefield Cup. Quick note, last year at the Sinquefield Cup, Gukesh had scored a perfect Giri, which I don't think he's ever done at any other tournament before. And last year's Sinquefield Cup was not very interesting to me. And honestly, I haven't watched the Sinquefield Cup very closely for several years now. It's tended to not be that exciting for me. And then this year, I had some kind of feeling before it started, like this year's going to be the year for the Sinquefield Cup, where it's going to be interesting for the first time in a while. And I was just, I had some hopes on Gukesh, Prague, Nodirbek, and Fabiano. I really feel like he's been playing very combatively this year, so I'm really excited to watch his chess right now. Ali Reza potentially will be playing well or excitingly. Either is good enough for me. I'm happy if they play well, and I'm happy if they play exciting chess. That gives me something to think about. A game like this where I can watch it live and then spend another 2-3 hours playing over it later and looking at ideas, just delighting in what kind of possibilities there are in chess. I'm not trying to prove who's better or worse or anything there, right? Or who's in good form even. Just delighting in, all these different moments where there's like cool moves. That in itself is one of the delights of chess, is just the tactics, not the strategy, always. And this game had so many cool little things to uncover and unearth in it. And I have, great hopes that we're going to see more games like that. So I'm off to watch round 3 live on stream. And also coming up this week, for those of you who like to watch our live streams, Kostya's playing in a tournament in Portugal, the Maya International. Kostya and Matt and Blood Queen and Rach Angel. So we're going to be watching a lot of that tournament live as well this week, as well as some Sinquefield when we've got the time. So we'll just be hoping to see some more games like this one with lots of excitement and interesting ideas for both sides, imbalances, exposed kings, powerful passers, and I'll see you later.